Hi, I'm Darlene Carman, and welcome to the show. My apologies go out to all of the good insects, critters, and their supporters who may be offended by this show. I have yet to meet a person who doesn't like ladybugs or butterflies. Our attention will be directed towards the less desirable ones that spread disease and create havoc in our homes. Russell Parman, Assistant Manager with the Santa Clara County Vector Control District, will update us on vectors and their diseases. Hey, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here.
And I thank you for bringing all these little goodies. We have lots of things to look at, so we'll just get right on to it. You know, I still say that the biggest worry that we have is mosquitoes. And I think a lot of people think that mosquitoes come around in the spring and the damp weather, but that hasn't been the case. It's very strong right now. So why does it keep prevailing?
Well, mosquitoes have been around for a long time, and they're very well adapted to what they do. What we're seeing this year, though, is a very sharp contrast to the prior few years, which were considered to be a severe drought. And so things tended to start rather slowly in the beginning of the drought seasons. This year, we're seeing exactly the opposite. We've got lots of extra water around. And so the particular species that's most active right now, we're seeing about 3 times more than normal for this time of year.
Wow.
And that is because this particular species, known as Culex tarsalis, and we have a couple of slides here that will show the folks what it looks like. But it's a very good flyer, and it's perfectly adapted to take advantage of all this widespread water. So typically what we see is that this species will get off to a big start early in the year. It'll tend to sort of die down a little bit later on, but right now, May and June, we've already seen these record-breaking numbers of mosquitoes, well above average. So they'll fly up to 25 miles. And like most of these critters we'll be talking about today, one of the things about insects in general is they make lots and lots of babies. And they can easily overwhelm a situation in a very short period of time. So if we could have the first slide. This one is called Culex tarsalis, and you can't quite see it, but right at the edge of the finger there, on the proboscis, and that's the part that pokes you, there's a little white band. They also have banded legs. They tend to bite in the early morning hours or after dusk. And this is one of the critters that carries West Nile virus. We also have another shot of that same species in slide 2. And there again, you can see the little arrow pointing at the white band. And you can actually see these if you have good eyes. And so this is the species right now that's the most active. And it's one of the more efficient vectors of West Nile virus. And then slide 3 shows another closely related species. This is called Culex pipiens. And one of the things is it has no band on its proboscis there, and it has no bands on the legs. And this guy likes to breed in foul water. So we find these guys in the catch basins. They'll even breed in cesspools sometimes. But they'll also breed in the same areas that Culex tarsalis does. This guy gets off to a slow start in most years. And then as the season progresses, going into August through October, their numbers tend to pick up. And again, it's another very efficient vector of West Nile virus, which is why we're so concerned about these 2 species in general.
Well, there's so many species. I did a little research and found out there's like 53 species in California, 19 in the Bay Area. So what are the diseases that this is like the native mosquitoes? What are the diseases that they have? The West Nile and what else?
Yeah, West Nile for these 2 that we just showed, West Nile virus is our primary concern. And so that landed in the U.S. back in 1999. And within by the time 2004 rolled around, it had come all the way out to California. So it swept across the country. We had our first signs of the virus very late 2004, and it's been with us ever since. So the first 2 years were very big, lots of dead birds, quite a few human cases. And so this virus, basically carried by these mosquitoes, this virus is amplified between the mosquitoes and the birds. And so we'll talk about that in a bit because that's a very important aspect. But the West Nile virus is the primary concern with these two particular mosquitoes.
And there was another one, what was that other one? Encephalitis, or I can't even say it.
Well, actually, with the West Nile virus,
Yeah,
it's about 8 out of 10 people that get infected will never know they had the virus. And so if you look at the cases, though, the next form up is called West Nile fever. About 25% of infected people will develop this, and it's like a very severe flu. However, it's no walk in the park, and there you average about 16 days off of work with that one. And in some cases, it will have follow-up effects that can last months. And then in a very small number of cases, we have what's known as neuroinvasive West Nile virus. And this is the one where you can develop encephalitis and other severe health problems. People over 50, people with compromised immune systems, diabetes, kidney problems, things like that are at a much higher risk of developing that particular form of the disease, developing symptomatic cases in general.
Wow.
So it's for those who get it and who get a symptomatic case, it's a serious thing.
Very serious.
Yeah.
Now, you were talking about dead birds, and so I noticed your literature that I was reading, and it talks about reporting to the dead bird hotline, and it mentioned crows and jays and magpies.
Right.
And I was just wondering, I have a lot of mockingbirds and other birds, so are these birds too small, they're not affected, or what? Why just crows?
There are a lot of birds that are affected by West Nile virus. The particular family of birds that crows belong to it also includes magpies and jays and birds like that. For some reason, they're very, very susceptible to this virus. And so much so that in crows, probably about 90% of the birds that get the virus will die from it.
Wow.
And so before they die, they develop lots of virus in their bloodstream. So much so that just about every mosquito that comes along and bites them will pick up the virus. And so what we find in the field is this amplifying. So the crows are really nice because they're bigger, they're more visible, and people can see them easily. And I think slide number 4 will show that. One of our staff picking up a bird. And we use those as our primary surveillance tool. Typically what happens here in our area is we'll get a cluster of dead birds, and when we find those clusters in an area, you will, and actually I'm sorry we forgot one slide here talking about swimming pools. And this is part of the mix of the equation for this particular virus. And one of the things that we do in a wet year like this, in most years, we'll go out and do aerial surveys of swimming pools. And so this particular shot is the ones we found just in our first survey this year. There were over 700 of those.
Wow.
And so that's one aspect of our surveillance. We do a lot of other things. And so following the dead birds around, these crows are big and black, they're visible. During 2014, if we can have the next slide, I believe, if we've got them there we go. So as you can see, and the cats tend not to carry them away as much, but there are a lot of other birds, even little sparrows that get involved in the cycle early in the season. And so a lot of very complicated dynamics with this virus, but the birds work well for us here. When we see a cluster of dead birds, we know that this virus is welling up out in the field in a certain area. And it has to do with what goes on between the mosquitoes and the birds. And so paradoxically, in the prior drought years, the virus was the worst almost that it had ever been. And people have a hard time getting a hold of that. Well, what happens in a drought is you've got all of these mosquitoes close to birds, which are all taking advantage of the scarcer sources of water. And so all that stuff that goes on between the mosquitoes and the birds happens a lot more efficiently in a drought year than it does this year when we've got water everywhere.
So what should people do? They see a dead bird. What do they do?
We want to call the state dead bird hotline, 1-800-West Nile Virus WNV bird, B-I-R-D. Okay. And what they do, it's a very sophisticated statewide system. They notify us of the birds. We go out and pick up the birds.
So people shouldn't really handle them, right?
No, not in most cases, unless you know, there's a need for that, and then we'll give instructions over the phone on how to do that. But the birds are very important. And so if we can go to the next slide, it'll show the map of 2014 dead birds. And so the black dots there are all the dead birds that we recorded, nearly 1,000 in 2014. And so when we have that kind of activity, we know something big is going on. We had lots of human cases that year. This year, we haven't found a single dead bird yet, which we're very happy about. But it has to do with the weather and what's going on that's different this season than the prior seasons.
I have a lot of crows in my yard, so
Yes.
I'm watching them closely, but
Yes.
they seem very happy and busy doing their usual routine.
Yes.
But if they're not lucky,
Yes, and we know that the virus is everywhere. It's just it's not terribly active everywhere all the time, but we know that this time of year the virus is out there. We've even had human cases in areas where the surveillance didn't show any activity. So people need to be aware that with mosquitoes, number one, it's all about the water. And so mosquitoes breed in water, and we want to eliminate those sources to the extent that we can. And this is true of most species of mosquitoes. And so that to the extent that folks can eliminate water on their properties, that is going to go a long way in towards cutting down the breeding of the mosquitoes.
what about the swimming pools?
Swimming
What do you
pools
do
are
with the
very
swimming
important.
pools?
And so we looked at the slide of the map. What we do is we do an aerial surveillance on swimming pools. And so this year we've logged another 700 on top of an inventory of about 1,500 that we already knew about of these neglected pools. And they're neglected for various reasons. And some folks can't afford to maintain the pools.
It's a lot of work.
Sometimes the properties are vacant.
Yeah.
Some folks just let them go in the winter and then pick up the maintenance back in the springtime. So, but there are a lot of them out there. In most of these things that we're talking about today, the public's eyes and ears are very, very important. So we need the public to tell us when they find, for example, neglected pools, or even if they have a neglected pool. We're not out to make people's lives miserable. We're here to help. And
Sure.
so the more that people tell us what's going on out there, the more that we can help.
So you go out there and tell them what they should do. You bring in mosquito fish for them, or?
Yeah, and so if we can have our first video, I believe we've got a picture of some mosquito fish, and we've got some on the table here too. About 600 out of 10 neglected pools that we find, we'll actually go and send our technicians out to each of these homes. About 6 out of 10 of those will plant mosquito fish in these neglected pools. And they're just like little guppies, and they're live bearers. Here's a shot of one doing their thing.
Whoa.
And so they're really ideal in a swimming pool because the fish don't have much else to eat.
And
so,
the chlorine doesn't bother them?
well, actually, usually we're putting these in unmaintained swimming pools. In
So
some
all-
areas, the 30% that we can't plant, a lot of times there are chloramines in the water that the fish don't do well with. But when somebody stops maintaining a chlorine chemical in their pool, that kind of dissipates pretty rapidly.
And so this is the larvae.
And so this is a mosquito eating the larvae.
Ooh.
And so what we're looking at here, we'll be moving into now a discussion of the other
Well, yes.
critters that are coming along.
We've got two invasive species now that are really coming into this area, or it's a threat, shall we say that?
Right.
It's a threat. So what are they, and how are they different from the common mosquitoes?
Well, they're different in a lot of ways. These mosquitoes have established themselves in Central California, over in the Fresno area, and also for many years down in Southern California. Two species. One's called the yellow fever mosquito, Aedes aegypti, and the other is called the Asian tiger mosquito, or Aedes albopictus. And so they're very small compared to the Culex mosquitoes that we've been talking about. And you can see here, one of those rows, you can see the tiniest mosquitoes
Oh, wow.
compared in size to the local guys.
Yeah.
And they're very small. Some of them can actually go through window screens. And the other big thing about these mosquitoes is that they are day biters. So unlike the Culex that feed at dawn and dusk, these guys will bite you all day long. And so even without disease issues associated with these mosquitoes, they're a severe nuisance, and they really are a game changer. They will make life miserable. So we don't want them here. And so again, we need folks to tell us if you're being bitten, especially if during the daytime. We need to hear about that,
Yeah.
because that's one indication that we may have these guys moving in. We know they love to hitchhike around in cars, so it's just a matter of time, we think, before they land in our neck of the woods. And so we're hoping to be able to catch them early, if at all possible.
Well, all mosquitoes are not desirable, but I've had people say to me, "Oh, mosquitoes don't bite me. They don't like me." Is there any truth to that statement, or
There is, actually. And so what we're finding out, and there's a lot of research going on right now
Yeah.
about this, and so there are, in fact, some people who put out more attractive chemicals than others. And so some people do tend to get bitten more than others. Some people are more sensitive to the bites and they notice them more. So it's all about, for the mosquitoes, we start out with carbon dioxide for the adult mosquitoes. And so we have some shots coming up perhaps a little bit later on in one of the videos.
Well, I think we're about ready to see
Okay,
some of
if we
these.
can see
Yeah.
the video with the larvae and the adults. So that's one of our invasive Aedes. Here we go. And so these are the larval mosquitoes. And basically the mosquitoes, again, this is why water is so important. They grow up as larvae, and in about 7 days, they'll go from egg to adult. And you can see they're very dependent on the surface. They actually have little siphons that they breathe through at the end of their bodies, and they kind of hang there, and they'll filter bacteria out of the water. So they're very prolific. If you were to allow them to continue after about 4 generations, you might have 100,000 mosquitoes from a single mosquito. And so then the adults, they are the ones that feed. The females are the only ones that feed. And you can see here, they get very excited. Somebody was actually breathing into this little chamber here. And so they can detect carbon dioxide way downwind from you. And this is one of the things that they use. And as they get closer, it's heat and it's other chemicals that your body releases that helps them to find you. So even some of our traps rely on some of this stuff.
Well, they're nasty little guys. We have some mosquito fish. But I want to take a moment to thank Vector Control for giving my husband and I a gift of mosquito fish at least 15 years ago. We have a pond, a waterfall pond, and they brought some out, and we've had them ever since. We don't do anything to them. They just come back every year, even through the winter. They come back, and more babies, and you know, they're kind of cute. And they're like little pets. No, I don't name them. But anyway, I just want to thank you for that, because it's something that's free that you guys provide.
Absolutely.
And it's a wonderful gift.
Yeah.
Thank you,
So,
because
we'll deliver them right to your door.
yeah, and that takes care of the mosquitoes. Well, we've spent a lot of time on mosquitoes, and it's very, very important. But there is another blood-sucking insect that's not known to cause disease, but no one really likes them, the bed bug.
Correct.
The bed bug. So they can't fly. So how come they're invading the area now, more so?
Well, what we've seen back in the 50s and 60s, they were practically eradicated, given the kinds of things they were doing to control back in those days. And we didn't hear much about bed bugs in Western Hemisphere up until about the early 2000s. And so we, here in Santa Clara County, around 2006, began to see a huge upsurge in bed bug calls. and they were doubling every year. We probably average about 200 or 300 calls a year now. Just like mosquitoes, they're very efficient and good at what they do, and they make lots of babies. So they're unlike mosquitoes, they're very flat. And we have an example here that's compared to a dime. They're very flat. They're not very big. They like to hide out because they're flat in crevices and nooks and crannies just about anywhere. They like to hide out near their host. That's you and me. And so they'll be in mattresses. They'll be in things that usually are close to the bed, but they make an awful lot of babies. And unlike mosquitoes, it's a very difficult control challenge because they like to hide out in very remote, inaccessible areas. So to the extent that somebody can reduce the clutter in their rooms, we give them less places to hide, fewer places to hide. It's also important to be very persistent and to cooperate with your pest control professional or with your landlord, because it takes a lot of teamwork to control these critters.
Well, they get anywhere. I was talking to a doctor that said a lot of the cases that they have are people that are traveling.
Mm-hmm.
Motels, hotels,
Right.
and it doesn't matter how expensive the hotel is,
Right.
because they're very friendly. And the thing is, a person traveling and they bring their suitcase into the next place, oops,
Mm-hmm.
and that's how they get around. Then they bring
Right.
them home.
Right.
So the doctor told me that there's actually an online resource, Bed Bug Registry.
Mm-hmm.
And I checked it out, and sure enough, if you're traveling, you can find out if the hotel or motel that you're staying, if they're on the registry. And I think that these are reported by people.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just one resource that the doctor told me about, which I thought was pretty valuable.
Right. Right.
But you really just have to search everything. I've heard cases even in the beddings of dogs or cats or
Mm-hmm.
just anything where they don't fly, but I guess they don't really hop. They just move.
They walk fast.
They walk fast.
They walk very fast. They walk, for example, in multi-housing units. They'll walk on the rafters between the units. So they're very good at what they do, and they have little behaviors that help them to avoid chemical treatments and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So that even adds to it. So you can pretty safely assume, though, that anywhere you go these days, you're at risk of encountering a bed bug. That's, and it's not about cleanliness. It's
No.
really just about how well these critters do what they do.
They're pretty resourceful, I
Yes.
guess. They just move around. So, and let's see, I think I did read in your literature that all stages of growth, they all like to suck blood.
Yes.
Whatever, there's like 5 stages or something.
Yes.
I had a lot of literature I read,
Mm-hmm.
but I thought that was interesting. Now, another thing that I find interesting is rats or mice.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you ask the average homeowner, do you have rats? Oh, no, they don't have rats or mice or whatever. And I would be one of those that would have said that
Mm-hmm.
until one night I was watching TV, looked out the window, and I could see mice hopping around limb to limb in my fig tree,
Mm-hmm.
dining on my figs. Then a little while later, a few days, a week later, during the daytime, I saw a mouse come across my window and go to the birdseed feeder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That was a wake-up call. So you can have rats if they're not in the attics or the garages. You can still have them. Where do they live?
Rats, kind of like bugs, they're very good at what they do. They're very good at avoiding predation. The key to rodent control is food, water, and shelter. Mm-hmm. So to the extent that we can avoid supplying these to the rats, this is actually our approach. We take an educational approach to rodent control. We don't go out putting a lot of poison bait around.
Yeah.
We simply educate homeowners to rodent-proof their homes. Mm-hmm. They'll live in wall voids. They'll live in dense ivy. They'll live at the top of palm trees. And they're quite acrobatic little critters. And so, for example, one of the things that we recommend is trimming all of your vegetation at least 18 inches away from the roof line.
Good idea.
A roof rat can squeeze through a hole the size of a quarter, and a mouse even smaller, a nickel or a dime, depending on how old they are.
Yeah.
So one of the keys is, first of all, we do offer free home and yard inspections for both mosquitoes and rodents. And our trained technicians have a good eye, and they can tell you what kinds of things on your property may be leading to a problem with rodents. And so,
Well, it can happen to anybody.
yes.
Um, I think one of the things is that we go walking around the neighborhood and we see apricot trees and so forth, and the fruit's all over the place. My fig tree, I mean, there's only two of us and few people we share them with, but in other words, it's an abundance that we can't possibly take care of all of it. So
Right.
I think that maybe dwarf trees would be the answer to people who really want to grow fruit, to dwarf varieties instead of these really big things, because the novelty wears off and then you have too much fruit and that's food. So I no longer have my fig tree, and I also do not feed the birds anymore because it's food. It's like you say, it's just really out there.
Right.
So in the summer, is there any other thing that you would like to talk about that's prevalent now in the summer months?
Well, with most of the insects especially, but even with vertebrates like rodents, the warm season obviously tends to be the busiest season. We occasionally see ants in the wintertime. They'll come into homes after heavy rains and things of that nature. So the warmer weather is better. Just an example, we get a lot of calls about cockroaches, the big black ones that for some reason like to hang out on the sidewalks, and people swear up and down that they're chasing them. And so people have a big repulsive factor with those kinds of things.
Yeah.
But just about any insect in general is going to be more abundant, more active in the summertime.
And then it tapers off in the winter.
And then as things cool down, it tends to taper off.
And then they come back.
They'll come back next spring.
And yellow jackets?
Yellow jackets tend to increase their activity in the fall. They actually start out in the springtime, but as we go through the warm year, their nest size builds. They make more yellow jackets, and so they get really active in the late fall, and because what they're doing is storing up supplies for the following winter, and they're really, really active.
Well, I think there's a lot of active ones around. I know in my pond, they're like harvesting the moss or something. But I really want to thank you for being here. There's been so much very helpful, useful information, and we all need to do our part. So we can do that by getting rid of all kinds of standing water, and also by cleaning up the clutter inside and out, trim the bushes, right? Maybe plant some dwarf trees instead of bigger ones if that's your thing. And I think we didn't really talk about it, but don't feed the wildlife. You're really not doing them a favor, right?
Absolutely.
Not doing
So
them a
it's
favor.
the same principle. And so with wildlife, we have a lot of adaptability, and
Yes.
a lot of people like to feed them because they're cute. And so don't
take
want
it-
to do that.
Take a lesson. Don't
Yes.
feed them. Thanks for watching the show. Watch again. Oh, there's so many good things to talk
Oh, I know.
about. Oh, we didn't talk about the raccoon.